There's a secret language under every car part listing. Search for brake pads for Ford F-150. What you'll see looks simple. A grid of products, prices, photos, brand names you recognize. But that's not what's actually happening. Because under every one of these listings, there's a language being spoken that most people never hear. These numbers aren't for you. They're not for marketing. They're not for copy. They are instructions. They tell machines exactly what the part is, what it fits, and just as importantly, what it does not fit. That's why this box doesn't show up for the wrong truck. And that's why when it shows up, Google is confident enough to put it in front of someone ready to buy. Most people think the modern aftermarket runs on ads, or platforms, or clever merchandising. It doesn't. It runs on shared language built quietly over decades so machines could finally understand cars the way humans used to have. Before that language existed, none of this worked, not at scale. The ability to type water pump Ford F-150 and get meaningful results, that was unthinkable 20 years ago. Not because the internet didn't exist, but because the data didn't know how to speak to itself. What you're seeing on this screen isn't just e-commerce, it's translated machine language. And the industry that figured out how to teach machines to understand fitment accidentally wrote grammar for modern e-commerce. So if the last section felt a little abstract, let's ground it. Because this language didn't appear because someone wanted better e-commerce. It appeared because the industry hit a wall. So 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the aftermarket wasn't digital. It was paper catalogs, tribal knowledge, counter people who knew things. A veteran behind the counter could hear the description, ask 2 questions, and pull the right part. Not because the data was good, because he was. And that worked until it didn't. SKU counts exploded, vehicle configurations multiplied, and people who carried that knowledge in their heads started retiring. At the same time, companies tried to digitize. Early electronic catalogs were built by brute force, teams of people keying in data from paper books. Years of work, massive cost. And even then, every company described parts differently. One spreadsheet said front rotor LH, another said front rotor L, another said LFT disc. Humans could infer that those were probably the same thing. Machines couldn't. And that was the problem. Every manufacturer, distributor, and retailer became the translator instead of a seller. Data had to be reinterpreted at every handoff. Errors multiplied quietly. Fitment mistakes, wrong orders, returns that shouldn't have happened. None of this showed up as a single failure. It showed up as friction everywhere. And this is the part most people miss. ACs and pies weren't invented to make catalogs cleaner. They were invented because commerce was breaking under its own complexity. Fitment especially became impossible to manage by intuition alone. One part could fit thousands of vehicle configurations. One vehicle could accept thousands of possible parts. That's not a human problem. That's a system problem. So, the industry did something rare. Competitors sat down together and agreed on a shared language. Not for branding, not for advantage, for survival. ACs came first. It was the Excel version of APAA or AAIA, now known as Auto Care Association Make and Model. It answered one brutally expensive question: does this part fit this exact vehicle configuration? Year, make, model, engine, and qualifiers. Not as text, but as code. Because if the fitment is wrong, everything downstream fails. And we are talking about returns, labor, trust. Pies followed, because once you know it fits, the next question is, what is this part and why should I choose it? Pies was the place where the product story lived. Descriptions, attributes, packaging, images, pricing, assets. It was structured, predictable, and machine-readable. Together they solved a deeper problem. They taught machines how to reason about cars. Not loosely, not approximately, but precisely. And once that language existed, something important happened. the industry stopped reinventing the basics. Data could move from one manufacturer to distributor to retailer without being retranslated every time. Barriers dropped, integration costs fell, innovation moved up the stack. It wasn't about controlling the market, it was about eliminating miscommunication. There's a phrase that comes up again and again in the industry discussions about these standards: speak the same language. And it wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. ACs and pies are grammar. They define how meaning is constructed so machines can act without guessing. And that decision to standardize the fundamentals did more than clean up catalogs. It quietly rewired how the aftermarket works. Which brings us to the next question. Now that this language exists, what exactly is it saying? Because ACs and pies aren't just acronyms, they're two very different dialects. And understanding the difference is where most people finally see why feeds, not ads, decide performance. So once the industry agreed on a shared language, the next problem was deciding what that language actually needed to say. Because describing a car part isn't one problem, it's two. First, does this part fit this exact vehicle? Second, what is this part and why should someone choose it? These questions sound simple, but at scale, they're anything but. That's why the language is split into two dialects. ACs handles fitment, pies handles product information. They're related, but they're not interchangeable. ACs is about eliminating ambiguity. It exists to answer one question with no room for interpretation. Does this part fit this exact vehicle configuration? Year, make, model, engine, sometimes trim, drivetrain, emissions, position. The details matter because the cost of being wrong is high. A single incorrect application can trigger returns, labor costs, and customer distrust. ACs isn't trying to be expressive, it's trying to be exact. It encodes vehicle applicability so machines don't have to guess. This is why ACs is built on reference databases and coded relationships rather than free text. Humans can reason loosely, machines can't. ACs removes that burden by turning fitment into structured logic. If ACs is wrong, everything downstream breaks quietly but expressively. Pies solves a different problem. Once fitment is confirmed, the buyer still needs to decide. What is this part? What category does it belong in? What is it made of? How does it perform? What comes in the box? What does it look like? And how is it packaged, priced, shipped, and supported? Pies is where product story lives, not as a marketing prose, but a structured truth. Attributes instead of adjectives. Assets instead of claims. Facts can be compared, filtered, indexed, and rendered consistently across systems. And this distinction matters. ACs doesn't sell the product, it makes the product eligible. Pies doesn't decide fitment, it creates confidence. Together they allow machines to reason end to end. A system can confirm that a 2018 Silverado owner is looking at a part that actually fits, understand what the part is, compare to alternatives, and present it in a way that feels intentional instead of accidental. And when those two dialects are aligned, commerce feels smooth. The right products show up, conversion happens without friction, returns stay low, systems trust the data. When they're not aligned, the machine doesn't stop. It guesses. And guessing is expensive. This is where a lot of teams get confused. They think of ACs and pies as documentation requirements, or compliance hurdles, or something the catalog team deals with. In reality, these standards are how modern systems make decisions. They are the grammar that allows platforms, marketplaces, and ad engines to operate without human intervention. Shopping ad doesn't decide what to show, it asks the feed. The feed doesn't reason, it gets inputs from ACs and pies. That's why two sellers can list the same brake pad at the same price and get very different outcomes. One is giving system clarity, the other is giving just enough to function. And ad algorithms always price uncertainty. Understanding the difference is the shift, because once you see ACs and pies as languages instead of formats, you stop asking, are we compliant? And start asking, Are we being understood? Now that we have separated the dialects, the next step is seeing what happens when this language starts running the entire aftermarket. Manufacturers, distributors, retailers, platforms, and ads all speaking through the same grammar at once. And that's where this stops being abstract and starts becoming operational. If this episode changed how you think about product feeds, shopping, or performance max, subscribe. This channel isn't about tactics or weekly optimization. It's for operators who want to understand why systems behave the way they do, so performance stops feeling random. And if you've got a question about your catalog, your feed, or where your data might be working against you, drop it in the comments. We read those. That's how we decide what break down next. So, once you understand these two dialects, AC is handling the fitment and Pi is handling the product truth, the next realization is where this language actually lives. It's not confined to catalogs. It's not something that only matters inside of a PIM or a spreadsheet. This language is running the entire aftermarket end to end, whether most people realize it or not. Every time a manufacturer updates a product, that update moves downstream through ACs and Pis. It flows to distributors, then to retailers, then into e-commerce platforms, then into marketplaces, then into the ad systems. And the same structured truth is being reused over and over by machines without anyone re-explaining it. And when it works, it feels invisible. Inventory updates propagate, prices change, availability adjusts, and product page reflects reality the same day the source data changes. That's not speed from marketing execution. That's speed from shared structure. And this is the part that's easy to underestimate. When someone searches for a part online, the system doesn't look it up in a way humans would. It resolves fitment through ACs, confirms product identity through Pis, checks availability, compares attributes, and then decides whether the product is eligible to be shown at all. That same logic powers e-commerce filters, VIN lookups, marketplace constraints, dropship decisions, and shopping ads. This is why people in the industry sometimes describe these standards as plumbing, not because they're boring, but because everything depends on them, and no one notices until something leaks. When ACs and Pis are synchronized, e-commerce scales cleanly. Orders flow without manual intervention, dropship models work, returns stay lower, systems trust what they're being told. When they're not, the failure isn't dramatic. It's subtle. Orders don't reconcile. Inventory looks available when it isn't. A part can be sold but not fulfilled. Or worse, it gets fulfilled incorrectly. And the industry has measured this. Unsynchronized data creates real operational cost. Invoice mismatches, order corrections, manual cleanup, returns that never should have happened. And this isn't theoretical friction. It's billions of dollars in avoidable waste across the supply chain. And notice what's missing from that list. None of these problems are solved by better ads. None of them are fixed by better creative or clever targeting. They're fixed by making sure every system involved is reading the same language and arriving at the same conclusions. That's why major retailers made these standards non-negotiable. If you can't supply ACs and Pis, you're not excluded because branding or strategy. You are excluded because the system can't reason about your products safely. At this point, the aftermarket is no longer human-mediated by default, it's system-mediated. Humans step in when something goes wrong, but the first decision, and the one that determines whether the product is even seen, is made entirely by machines reading structured data. Which leads us to an uncomfortable realization. Once everyone is speaking the same language, same grammar, using the same standards, something else starts to happen. Everything begins to look the same. And that's where the next tension shows up, because standardization solved chaos, but it also created sameness. That's what we need to talk about next. So once this language starts running the entire aftermarket, something interesting happens. It works. Chaos disappears. Errors drop. Systems scale. But there's a side effect that no one talks about enough. Everything starts to look the same. When everyone uses the same standards, the same reference tables, the same minimum required fields, listings converge, titles resemble each other, specs align, attributes match, Images follow the same patterns. From the machine's point of view, that's a success. The data is clean, comparable, and predictable. But from the buyer's point of view, it feels different. Scroll through the shopping results page and you'll see immediately same parts, same vehicles, same information presented 6 different ways. The system has done its job, but it hasn't told which option is better. And when the system can't surface meaningful difference, it defaults to the simplest signal it has: the price. This isn't a platform problem. This is not Google being aggressive or Marketplace being unfair. It's the natural outcome of bare minimum standardization. ACs and pies make products eligible and comparable, but they don't automatically make them distinctive. And that distinction matters. The industry materials are clear on this point. When customers can see a compelling value story in product data, price becomes the decision driver. Not because buyers are irrational, but because information available to them doesn't support a better choice. The system did what it was designed to do. It normalized the inputs. Think of it this way. We taught every brand to speak the same grammar, but we didn't teach them how to say anything interesting. So the marketplace becomes quiet. Not visually loud, quiet in meaning. And in that silence, pricing does the talking. This is where people misdiagnose the problem. They look at identical listings and assume the standards failed, or that standardization killed differentiation. That's not quite true. The standards did exactly what they were supposed to do. They removed ambiguity. They eliminated chaos. They made scale possible. What they didn't do, or were never designed to do, was add judgment, emphasis, or context. And that part is still on the operator. ACs ensures the product is shown to the right vehicle. Pies ensures the product is described accurately and consistently, but neither decides how clearly the value is communicated, how confidently the buyer can self-select, and how effectively the product stands apart from others. When teams stop at compliance, everything flattens. When they treat structured data as the finish line instead of the foundation, they end up competing in the race they didn't mean to enter. This is the paradox. Standardization solved the hardest problem the industry had, and then it exposed the next one. Because once everyone speaks the same language, the advantage doesn't come from speaking louder. It comes from saying more with the same words. That's where the opportunity actually is. If this way of thinking resonates, and you want it without the algorithm noise, we publish a Parts and Profits newsletter. It's not news, it's not tactics of the week. It's how data, structure, and economics actually shape performance in the aftermarket, written for people who run real businesses and want fewer surprises. And if that's your lane, the link is below. Read it on your own time. So, once you see the paradox clearly, that standardization created sameness, the question isn't whether ACs and pies are enough. The question is, what do you do with them? Because brands that scale don't reject the standards. They lean into them. And they don't just stop at compliance. This is where most teams draw the line too early. They treat ACs and pies as like a checklist. Required fields filled, errors resolved, feed approved, and then they move on, assuming that differentiation happens somewhere else. But the industry materials are clear on this. The standards were never meant to eliminate competition. They were meant to eliminate miscommunication. Everything beyond that is still a fair game. That's where enrichment comes in. Not marking copy layered randomly on top of data, but meaning encoded inside the structure. Titles that reflect how people actually search, not how parts are named internally. Attributes that explain functional differences instead of just existing as technical trivia. Images that remove uncertainty at glance because machines surface them, but humans still decide. This is why pies evolved the way it did. Attributes became standardized because retailers couldn't merchandise effectively without them. Digital assets became first-class data because products without images simply didn't sell. The industry learned by consequence that structured clarity protects margin. And this isn't theoretical. When product data is enriched properly, systems behave differently. Click-through rates rise because relevance improves. Cost per click drops because machine is more confident. Conversion increases because buyers can self-select without friction. None of that happens because the ad is clever. It happens because the data tells a clearer truth. Same logic applies to control. Smart teams don't expose their entire catalog equally. They use custom labels to signal importance to the system. Think of margin tiers, bestsellers, seasonal products, inventory constraints. That information doesn't change what the product is, but it changes how aggressively it's distributed. And it's still the same language, same grammar, same standards. The difference is the intent. You're no longer just describing products so machines can function, you're guiding how machines prioritize. And notice what's happening here. The differentiation isn't coming from breaking the rules. It's coming from using the rules fully, from understanding that ACs and pies define how meaning is constructed. And within that structure, clarity compounds. The industry has said this in different ways over the years, but it all collapses to the same point. When customers can't decide which product is better, price becomes the boss. Enriched data changes that equation by making value visible without a salesperson in the room. And this is how brands stand out in the standardized world. Not by being louder, not by being clever, by being unmistakably clear. Which leads us to a broader realization. What happens in the automotive aftermarket isn't unique, it's just earlier. ACs and pies are one of the industry's answers to the universal problem. How do you teach machines to understand complex reality at scale? And once you see that, it's not hard to notice the same pattern everywhere else. If you're watching this and thinking, I can see how this breaks, but I don't know where ours is leaking, that's normal. Most teams don't have an ad problem. They have an interpretation problem. The system is making decisions based on inputs they have never really looked at together. That's what our Scube game plan is built for. It's not an audit, it's a diagnostic. We look at your feed, your merchant center, and your shopping and PMAX structure as one system, so you can see where performance is actually being capped. And if that sounds useful, the link is below. So, once you understand how brands add voice to a standardized language, it becomes hard not to zoom out. Because what happened in the automotive aftermarket isn't a niche story, it's one of the earliest and cleanest examples of doing something much bigger. Every complex industry eventually hits the same wall. Scale breaks intuition. Human judgment can't keep up. And if the machines are going to sit between buyers and sellers, those machines need a way to understand reality without interpretation. That's what ACs and pies really are. Not catalog standards, grammar. They define how meaning is structured so systems can reason consistently across thousands of companies, millions of products, and endless combinations. Fitment becomes logic. Product truth becomes attributes. Assets become signals. And once that grammar exists, commerce can happen without someone explaining every decision. You see the same pattern everywhere. Real estate has MLS feeds that encode location, features, eligibility, so platforms can function. Travel relies on global distribution systems that standardize routes, pricing, and availability. Music lives on metadata, artists, tracks, rights, so discovery and royalties work at scale. Healthcare runs on structured code, so diagnoses, billing, and treatment can even exist in the same system. Different industries, same problem, same solution. Machines don't understand stories, they understand structure. If you want to be visible in a machine-mediated economy, you have to speak clearly in a language the system can parse. And that's the real takeaway from ACs and pies. The aftermarket didn't win because it had better ads or better platforms. It won because it agreed early on how to encode truth. Once that happened, everything else could layer on the top. E-commerce, marketplaces, ads, self-service buying, and infinite aisles. And here's the part that matters now. As more industries digitize and more decisions get mediated by the systems, the advantage shifts not to whoever is the loudest, not to whoever has the most spend, but to whoever understands how meaning is constructed inside the machine. This is why data literacy is no longer a technical concern, it's a strategic one. If you treat structured data as a checkbox, you get table stakes. If you treat it as a language, you get leverage. You gain control over how systems interpret your products, how confidently they match demand, and how much uncertainty they price into every interaction. That's what Aces and Pies quietly taught the aftermarket. They didn't just standardize parts, they showed how modern commerce actually works. And once you see that, the final question becomes obvious. If the structure is grammar and enrichment is the voice, where does true competitive advantage really comes from next? And that's what we'll unpack in the next episode. So when you step back and look at the full arc, Aces and Pies weren't really about cataloging parts. They were about preserving understanding as the industry scaled past what people could hold in their heads. And that's fitment knowledge, product knowledge, judgment that used to live with the experienced counter professional got encoded into structure so machines could carry it forward. That solved chaos, it made the modern aftermarket commerce possible, and then it quietly raised the bar for everyone. Because once the structure exists, there's no advantage in having it, it's just the cost of entry. The real question becomes how you see it. Some brands treat data as something they maintain, others treat it as something they wield. Same standards, same grammar, very different outcomes. The industry materials make this clear in hindsight. Standards eliminate friction, but they don't decide winners. They create conditions where judgment, clarity, and intent matter again, just expressed through systems instead of people. That's where we are now. Machines are no longer just passing information through. They're making decisions about relevance, eligibility, and priority. They decide what gets seen and what gets suppressed, and what gets priced at premium because it understood clearly enough to trust. If you see Aces and Pies as compliance artifacts, you'll always feel like you're reacting. And if you see them as language, you start asking different questions. Where is uncertainty creeping in? Where's the meaning they lost? Where are we letting the systems guess when we could be precise? That shift from maintenance to intent is where the competitive advantage actually lives. Now, in the next episode, we're going to move out of history into strategy. We'll look into how teams that win don't just publish better data, but use structure to shape visibility, economics, and control. Not hacks, not tricks, but leverage. Because once you understand the grammar of the machines, the next step isn't learning to speak louder, it's learning how to be chosen. And that's where we are going next. And if you want help applying this in your business, without guessing, without patching symptoms, you can book a discovery call with my team. We work with the aftermarket brands every day. We don't chase tactics, we fix data, structure, and visibility so performance becomes predictable instead of stressful. And if that sounds like the kind of work you need, the link is in the description. Otherwise, keep watching the series, and I'll see you in the next episode.